welcome to another exciting episode of CS Teaching Talks, where research meets reality. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Tomford, and when I'm not reading papers or discussing them, you can find me teaching computer science to pre-service teachers at Reach University. The paper we're looking at today is called Integrating Parsons Puzzles Within Scratch Enables Efficient Computational Thinking Learning. The authors are Jeff Bender, Bingpu Zhao, Alex Dziena, and Gail Kaiser. It was published in 2023 in the journal Research and Practice in Technology Enhanced Learning. And I'm delighted to welcome this week's guests.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Bacon. I am the Director of Pedagogy at Codercy, which is a computing and robotics education organization, and my pronouns are they or she.
I'm Ryan. I recently graduated from UCSD in computer science, but now I'm a CS Ed volunteer. My pronouns are he, him.
And I'm Jason Zagami. I'm an academic in Australia at Griffith University.
The paper we're looking at this week is called Integrating Parsons Puzzles Within Scratch Enables Efficient Computational Thinking Learning. So this is a great one that we're going to break down all the ideas in, all the terms in the title, and we're going to figure out what the implications are for teaching, and especially for teaching K-5, which is where we see Scratch and where a lot of the research on computational thinking is happening. Let's start out just first getting on the same page by attempting a summary of what the paper set out to do.
They were looking to see how different kind of forms of scaffolding in helping learners acquire knowledge around computational thinking concepts. In particular, I think sequencing was called out. And the three conditions that they had were Parsons problems, where it's essentially you give everyone the blocks that they need to create the program, but they're not in the right order. So you have to put them in the right order, essentially. There are Parsons problems with distractors, which means in addition to the blocks they need, they're going to have some other blocks that they don't need. So it just kind of like adds a little bit of another challenge that you have to do. And then a condition in which they just had all the blocks that they would normally need. And they had two sort of hypotheses. One was that the conditions that were more scaffolded, the ones with the Parsons problems and the Parsons problems with distractors, would reduce the extraneous cognitive load, so they wouldn't need to spend their mental energy on things that were not important to learning, and they would have more motivation, and that the Parsons problems would give the highest learning efficiency, so they would learn the most with the least effort and time.
I think from what I was able to gather, something to note is that the sample was actually on adults, not the target audience of the K through 6. They stated that the sample size was probably too small to really confirm anything really. So they just had a lot of air of
Like
confidence in
limitations.
that. Yeah, limitations. They just wanted to make sure that they stated their limitations. And it seems like the concepts didn't get too complicated. It was mostly just sequences. And they didn't even cover like conditionals and looping. So that's something to keep in mind.
It's just starting out. Does anyone have experience with Parsons puzzles?
Parsons problems are essentially where it's a partially completed problem or partially completed solution, and students then select from elements to complete the solution. In this case, they're using it more as a reduction in the possible tools to use to complete the solution, rather than a partially completed solution that they have to then finalize, which is the traditional Parsons puzzle, Parsons problem type structure. I essentially see the examples that they've used is more about ordering. So it's a traditional process of an ordered quiz where you're choosing from a selection of options and putting them in the correct order.
I first experienced this once when I had entered college. So this was in the beginner's programming course. And what I found was that it was really nice to know that all the pieces were right there. And like in the worst case scenario, if you were to not know anything, you could still like technically brute force it. You just save a lot more time in getting through with it. And so the context was that The assigned readings were kind of like assignments in the sense that we just had to complete them. They were for participation. And so you just complete it before the day. And then when you go into class, we'd be ready to go and do some discussion on those things. So that was essentially my experience with it. I thought it was a pretty pleasant experience. It, I didn't see it at all used outside of that beginner concept, and I'm not sure if it would have worked outside of that. But just an initial thought on it is that like the paper's findings were that there's very low cognitive load because everything's out there. You don't need to think about what else you could add to it. And so I think that is really huge. It's kind of like when you're starting, in my mind, with like a blank page, and you're like, wow, I need to start building up this page to be a bunch of other things. Knowing exactly what blocks you just slot in there to play with, I think that helps a lot from my experience as a student.
When we design sort of the learning progressions, we use Parsons problems, either partially completed solutions like Jason described, or the more sort of like, these are out of order, put them in order. We do that to a certain extent as well. But just not as like its own thing without doing anything else. It's part of a progression that starts off highly scaffolded, and then the scaffolding kind of falls away. So they will eventually see that blank page at the end, but at the beginning, it's really just saying, okay, we're either going to we do it in kind of two ways. One is we're showing, like, kind of including a worked example, the way Jason was saying, a partially completed thing. If they're learning something about conditionals, maybe there's an example of a conditional inside the code that's already there and they have to do new ones. So kind of embedding a worked example, or maybe having something where they don't have to do all of the other part of coding to make this thing happen, but they only need to do the thing that's relevant to the particular thing they're learning at the time. So yeah, just like the traditional scaffolding part of it, but it always is followed by something that's more open-ended, because otherwise I think that the end goal is that the learner can do it independently. So that was one of the things that I kind of didn't respond too well to in the paper, that it seemed like they did the Parsons problems and then they had a multiple choice assessment. But for me, and this is something I've seen a couple times in papers, it's like you have scaffolding and then the scaffolding never falls away. And so that doesn't, I don't really see how that works. So we use it a little bit differently as well than how they described it in the paper.
Yeah, this is great. I found a real commonality in what you were saying around Ryan was referencing the cognitive load. Jason was talking about constraining the problem space. And Elizabeth is talking about scaffolding. And this is, I think, a really great way of like addressing the same problem, right? What does the learner have to go through in order to learn the objective? And so in this paper really situated it in terms of cognitive load. And I want to ask, really, what is our goal with reducing cognitive load? What is that? How is that serving our students?
Yeah, I think Parsons problems, like the reason why they're effective is because they reduce cognitive load. Like they mentioned that in the study, there's a table at the very bottom of this reading that like shows like the cognitive load levels if you have it completely unconstrained versus if you do have it constrained with and without distractors. So I think that's really interesting, and those are also similar findings that I had when I was learning it. I still get like very overwhelmed sometimes when starting with an app or in the design process, because the very first step that I take when I'm building anything is to reduce the amount of elements that I have to play with until I get something rolling, and then I start adding it back in. So I think having a bunch of scaffolding and then slowly removing it is really beneficial.
I have really strong opinions on how they address cognitive load here, because they were talking about the difference between the germane cognitive load, so the things you want to be thinking about because the things that you're learning, so the more you think about it, the better, and then the extraneous cognitive load, so the parts that you don't want to think about because they're not really important to what you're learning. But then it seemed to me some of the things that they described as extraneous cognitive load were about choosing the correct piece of code or code segment, which to me is not extraneous at all. Like maybe you can scaffold it away initially because you're trying to focus on them being able to do just one kind of part of the problem, but eventually they need to do that. So I think that was what was interesting to me, that kind of got pushed off to the side as being extraneous, where it was germane to me. And then at the end, they said that they actually did have more efficiency in learning or something when they had those distractors. Like a lot of it is sort of managing that frustration of like, you want to be just frustrated enough that you're learning something, but not so much that like you didn't actually have to think about it at all. And so you didn't go through any learning. They took some things that I thought would be important mistakes to make and important things to think about, and then said that they were extraneous, which I didn't think was the case.
I think from my perspective, cognitive load is not in and of itself, something I'm chasing. Really, it's instead, especially with the younger kids, it's about how the emotional reaction to too big a cognitive load can affect their behavior, their engagement with the material, their willingness to continue, right? So, I mean, for me, it's all about getting kids to persist and to not give up and to use the resources and communicate and everything. And if they feel overwhelmed, right, then emotionally they might shut down, which then affects their learning. So it's, for me, it's not the direct effect of cognitive load on learning. It's mediated through emotional behavior.
But I would say that that's mostly what people are looking at when they're looking at cognitive load, is the, avoiding cognitive overload. So I do think that that's something that is like, yes, it's true that you can say, oh, you're not spending enough time learning because you're spending time on all this other stuff. I think that's true. But I think that generally, if you're learning something within well, let me back up a little bit. When I'm thinking about cognitive load and scaffolding, I'm thinking that we're trying to give them a task that seems somewhat authentic, but authentic tasks tend to be a little bit more complex than something that would be really targeted and artificial. So this cognitive load is there to take away some of the work that they would have to do on this authentic task. But given that it's an authentic task, anything that they're working on in solving this authentic task is probably not a bad thing for them to be learning. It's just, it's not the thing that we're focused on learning right now. And like you said, if they experience cognitive overload, it's just gonna, they're gonna shut down. So I think, we look at some types of cognitive load that are saying, okay, we're gonna take away part of the task, or we're gonna do this way. But then there are also things that we can look at with cognitive load that are actually more like effective. Like if it's a fun task, you won't necessarily experience cognitive overload because you enjoy putting all the work into it. So I don't think, like, the way that you described it is like exactly the way that, like, most of the people that I talk about when we talk about scaffolding and cognitive overload, it's really, maybe that's because I am working with younger learners, it's so that they will feel okay doing it. And it's about that self-efficacy. But I think also with self-efficacy, you have to think if it's too easy, they're not going to have self-efficacy because they're going to be like, well, I didn't actually do it. Like all I did was like push the run button. So I actually don't learn how to code. And I think that that's also something that intersects with equity issues around like imposter syndrome. So it's something we have to be particularly careful of. But I don't disagree with what you're saying. And that's kind of what I experienced as like the mainstream approach to managing cognitive load, at least in K-12 education.
The particular setting that they used for this experiment was a version of Scratch that they engineered to have special features. And so the learner was presented with the, blank page in the middle where you write all your stuff, and then a specific number and inventory of blocks that they were allowed to use, and a description of what the program should look like. So the activity they had to do was read the description and then get the code to match that, to execute it so it matched the description. And the paper cites that Scratch in particular is a high agency, low structure tool, which, Jason, you referred to as, a constructivist learning environment. And we really like it for its high agency features, but its low structure features are some of the things that, the Parsons problem is trying to mediate, is trying to address.
This experiment, from my understanding, I thought they had given like the example code that they're trying to build, and that they were supposed to rebuild the that code using different blocks. Was it like that, or was it that they saw the output of what the target goal was, and they were trying to recreate that with their selected blocks?
My understanding is that it's so much more confusing than that. Like
Okay.
they started off like, yes, they saw what the code was doing. So it was almost like you saw the scene or the story or whatever that was created by the code. And then you had particular code blocks that you could use to then recreate that to try to make it happen. But it wasn't just that. They had like points assigned to the blocks in some way, and they used
Yeah.
the Manhattan distance of how far away the blocks are to where they wanted them to be. And there was a timer, and you were somehow evaluated on how many like actual moves that you made. So it felt so anti-Scratch. It was like, don't explore anything. Do it as fast as you can in as few, like it just like, do exactly what we want you to do. Don't explore along the way, and try to like move things to the exact place we expect them to be in the scripts pane. So it was because they didn't want them to guess and check, but then it appeared that with a point system, that indicates that they're using some sort of like hill climbing strategy to get closer and closer to the right answer, which seemed like they were facilitating guess and check.
Yeah, and I think those two things kind of put our, learning strategies at odds. If we're incentivizing putting all the code together and pressing run and getting it right on the first time, that's the opposite to how we teach people to put in one block at a time and test your solution iteratively.
Did the participants know that like every like, move that they were doing kind of affected their end score?
Yeah, they did because
Oh,
they wanted
okay.
because they wanted it to be a measure of how quickly and efficiently they could do it. So they had to know that they were being evaluated. Otherwise, they might just be doing whatever they wanted in this constructivist tool.
Were they told like what activities would affect their score, and did they see their score, or were they just like told that, hey, we'll be tracking your data, so pick
There was
wisely?
definitely a timer. Like there's
Okay,
definitely a timer.
so they
I
definitely
noticed
saw the
that.
timer. Oh, that
Yeah.
is stressful.
I mean, talk about if we're trying to lower cognitive load and mediate emotional behavior and everything, giving someone that kind of stress, that doesn't seem helpful.
Yeah.
This paper frames guess and checking as a negative, whereas in a
Seems like it.
constructivist approach, it's actually a positive in that students are exploring and experimenting and trying out different ideas to develop their solutions. So this idea of trying to get the perfect solution by going through a very set specific pathway has challenges in learning programming. Because for students, yes, if you want to learn just the perfect way of doing this particular sequence, it's okay. But once problem sets get beyond that, the flexibility of exploring and learning a whole range of different ways of solving problems and knowing that there are multiple ways of solving a problem overlays the benefit of just learning the most efficient way of solving a problem.
I don't have a problem with kids guessing and checking. I think it makes sense, but that's why you have a teacher there that sort of like has these is able to talk to them and help them do sense making out of what they've experienced. So guessing and checking is about collecting a bunch of experiences, and then you have to do sense making from those experiences and create models of how things are working that you can then use later. So it's not that guessing and checking is bad, it's that all the way at the end of the learning process, when they're completing the activity and they've supposedly already learned it, they shouldn't be guessing and checking. They should have created that mental model. But while you're still creating that mental model, guessing and checking is a totally valid strategy of doing it. And then that is the more sort of constructivist strategy, rather than saying, like I do, we do, you do, you better not make any mistakes because I already told you how to do it. I front loaded all the information at the beginning of the class. So I totally agree with what you're saying, Jason. And I think that maybe sometimes you see like one strategy that's effective at one particular thing or is effective at, supporting in a particular way. And, you hear it's effective and then people start putting it everywhere. So, but that doesn't mean it's good at everything. It doesn't mean like what you need to be doing at one point in the learning process isn't what you need to necessarily be doing at the other point in the learning process. Like, like direct instruction is great, but maybe that doesn't mean that's all that you're doing the whole time. There's a time and place for it, just like there's a time and place for guess and check. And I think that's sort of what we see missing sometimes for these studies, is that they're just doing one strategy and that's all that they're doing because they're trying to test that strategy. But that's not reflective of how learning works. You needed a variety of strategies, not just to differentiate between learners, but to differentiate between where they are in the learning process.
Well, there's another concept in the paper that may be controversial, and that is around learning efficiency.
As an academic process, I think it's useful to try to measure efficiency and those sort of things. In terms of classroom practice, I think it would be, as Elizabeth mentioned, it'd be very problematic if that was your only focus on trying to maximize efficiency, because that then loses a whole lot of the other elements of learning around the joy of learning and curiosity and experimentation and creativity. So there is a place for measuring and optimizing and so forth. And from an academic perspective, that's probably where it sits. But in terms of everyday classroom practice and teaching, it's only a small element of a much richer environment that we want to encourage in education.
I wish I had something to support this, but it's my understanding that sometimes when it takes you longer to learn something, that learning persists more than if you learn something immediately. So like getting somebody to learn something really quickly because you put them in this artificial constrained environment, and now they're really successful on the assessment measure at the end of your 1 hour session, doesn't mean that number one, they're going to be able to transfer it into a novel situation or like abstract out what that meant and use it across disciplines. But it also means that like a week later, maybe they've forgotten it, whereas the learner who like really struggled and had to grapple with it and really take that effort to put those mental models together, because either they were creating that mental model and exploring the conceptual understandings rather than just like memorizing a procedure of, like this procedural of kind of disconnected actions. Like maybe that person who took that time to really kind of wrap their head around what they're doing, it stuck with them. So I think that this sort of like the speed run to the learning objective is probably not where we want to go. Not to say that we want kids to like struggle and struggle and struggle, but like this, like just to say efficiency, and they say they did it in as few moves as possible. Like maybe they learned something that the people who just like got to the end of the activity. So this didn't appear to be efficiency in learning to me. This appeared to be efficiency in completing an activity. And I think that that's something that you've got to differentiate between, is like, is the goal for them to complete the activity successfully, or is the goal for them to understand something? Like we're not teaching students so that 5 minutes later they can do well on a multiple choice test.
Yeah, the study did do an attempt to do an attitudinal survey of how, and I actually suspect that while originally I was quite critical of that because it didn't seem to be relevant to their study, it may actually be the most relevant element, because the study didn't really go into why students needed to learn sequence. What was the actual purpose in terms of the curriculum or the rationale and outcomes of a program of study? And changing attitude may be a better outcome than being able to sequence in terms of what we would be attempting to teach this for. So while originally I was quite dismissive of that element, it may actually be more important than originally noted. But I think that's always important, that we need to contextualize why students are learning these specific concepts so that we can then know what value to them place, other than just a measure of whether or not they can do a particular activity or not.
Well, thank you to all of our guests, and thank you for listening to this episode of CS Teaching Talks. You are welcome to join us in any future discussion of our CS Ed research papers, both old and new. We meet Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Pacific and Fridays at 4 p.m. Pacific, and everyone is welcome whether or not you have read the paper. And we'd also love to hear from you if you have any questions or suggestions for future readings, or just reflections about the papers that we've looked at or ones you've looked at on your own. Please email us at podcast@csedresearch.org. The CS Teaching Talks podcast is presented by csedresearch.org and Reach University. Funding has been provided by the Association of Computing Machinery's Special Interest Group for Computer Science Education and Amazon Future Engineer. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.